Hey, everybody. Great to be here. Thanks for joining. My name's Mark Wataziak, aka Woj. I lead the research and strategy team at Code 42. Thanks again for taking the time. We're gonna we're gonna run through. I'm gonna try and keep this. I know it's Wednesday, so we're gonna keep this as quick paced and light as possible. And I always like to start with a quote. This is a real. I love this quote. Dan Rather actually said this. He actually tweeted this. And he was obviously talking about journalism. And he said, "How do we find the signals of truth amidst the noise of disinformation and propaganda?" And when I first saw that quote, I was like, wow, that's applicable to a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. And in this session, we're going to dive in deep into a few areas. And it's largely centered, and I think the title of this presentation is Insider Risk, a Data Protection Problem. We're going to talk about that data protection problem. We're also going to talk a little bit about a pragmatic, contextual approach to that problem that's largely outcomes driven. So get your buzzword bingo cards out, because I might throw a few of your favorite security buzzwords out. But the image you see on the right here, we use this often to describe how employees work today. It's no longer linear. It's a mess. It's a mess of activity, and in that mess of activity, what you ultimately end up with is what we call insider risk. And insider risk, we consider a data protection problem. So a little bit of a level set before we jump into the best way to understand this problem, to manage this problem, to mitigate risk to data. Let's level set on some definitions, just so we're all on the same page, right? So at Code 42, we think of it this way. We think there's two different, dichotomies here. You've got an insider risk problem, and you've got an insider threat problem. An insider threat, everyone kind of jumps to the kind of definition of malicious user. It's the 1% of employees that are doing bad things, right? They have malicious intent. They could be, stealing data, sabotaging, deleting, whatever it might be. And in an insider threat world, you focus on specific users committing isolated acts of exfiltration with malicious intent. That's how we define kind of an insider threat. What we're talking about today is a bigger problem, insider risk, and we coin it more as a data protection problem, not a user problem, but a data problem. And it just naturally comes with the way people work, the way employees work. It doesn't focus on any explicit set of users. It doesn't focus on any explicit set of data. It looks at all users. We got to look at all data. We got to look at all possible vectors in which that data is moving, no matter the intent of the employee. And how do you manage this? How do you manage this magnitude of risk that is largely pervasive across organizations, no matter size, scope, industry, whatever it may be? So our contention is, can we solve for this problem first? Can we solve for insider risk? Because if we solve for insider risk, we can inevitably solve for any malicious actors inside the organization, aka insider threat. So just an initial level set on definitions and what we're talking about. We see them as two distinct problems. So where does the problem come from? I'm going to hit, since I'm in research and strategy, of course, what would a slide deck be without stats? And I'm not going to pummel you with too much. We'll get into the practical application of insider risk management in a minute, but let me just level set with some context around what we see and hear in the marketplace. So this is going to be familiar to, I'm going to say, all of you, right? So you think about what security teams have to deal with right now. Thousands of endpoints connected to thousands of users with access to millions of files, whether those files are being created, whether they're being modified, whether they're being deleted. And now you overlay, with remote work, hybrid workforce, you overlay the multitude of productivity and collaboration tools that employees have access to both sanctioned and unsanctioned, means you literally have hundreds of vectors of potential data exposure, data exfiltration, data loss, data theft, whatever it may be. Now you compound that with the impact of work from home over the course of the last year, and the COVID effect, as we call it. And we did some research on this in the last year of what that impact was, and security leaders are saying, well, what we're seeing is employees are nearly twice as likely to have leaked data than they were pre-COVID. And that's not surprising, given they're working from home, they're using different devices, they're accessing the cloud's tools that they want, whether it's a personal productivity tool, whether it's whatever it may be, right? So how do you begin to deal with this problem? How do you begin to deal with the magnitude of this noise, this image we show of like how people work, and truly understand where risk exists, where meaningful risk exists within this sea of noise, and how employees work? Well, we asked, what makes it so hard? Why is it so hard to manage? Why is it so hard to detect risk that is of material meaning to the business? And 2/3 of the security teams we talked to said, we just can't prioritize the ones that matter. We don't have the context. We don't understand what is everyday collaboration and what is exfiltration. We don't understand, in a sea of alerts to triage within their SIM or whatever their operational process is, what are the things to focus on? And a lot of times they're relying on putting pieces together. A lot of times they're relying on their own intuition to prioritize the risks that matter. And then what you end up with is a lot of shall I say, alert fatigue, right? Noise, whatever it might be. So why is there context missing? Why don't you have the context to manage the insider risk problem? And this was shocking that 91% said we just don't have the tech. We don't have the tech that's purpose built for this problem. The new way people work, the hybrid workforce, the remote workforce, whatever it may be. We're piecing together tech that we have to try and understand where we need to focus, how we manage this problem, where we assign additional security training, what security training should we focus on, et cetera, et cetera. And we start to peel back this onion of, well, what are they using? Like, what are they trying to do? How are they trying to piece together technology in order to manage this problem? And if you think of it at its core, insider risk is fundamentally different than the way we've done data protection in the past, right? We follow this tried and true of, let's identify where our sensitive files are, right? So now let's use classification and tags to tag those files as sensitive. Then let's create a policy to monitor that file movement, and then inevitably block that file movement should that policy be broken. This compliance-centric approach is very linear-based. It's very rules-based, and we're all familiar with this. It was largely built when we were all on-prem. You converse that with the insider risk problem, where you've got this sea of activity, user activity. You got again, go back to that, thousands of endpoints, thousands of users, millions of files, hundreds of exfiltration vectors or destinations that these files can move, largely in the cloud. And what do you end up with? You end up with more exposure. You end up with more data exposure. You end up with this lack of context and ability to prioritize. And inevitably, you end up with coming to the realization, we just don't have the tools or the purpose-built tech to manage this problem. And the approach is different. So when we think about it, we think about this terms of and I tweeted it, put this out on Twitter a few weeks ago around is there anything that's static about data risk anymore? And there was some commentary like, no, risk is all dynamic these days. But when you think about static risk and how we've managed the problem in the past, and still currently manage the problem from a compliance standpoint, is that whole identify, classify, policy block mentality. And the outcome is rooted in preventing a data breach. and that outcome is obviously true. But in this new world of insider risk and how you manage insider risk, you got to have the contextual information behind that, those millions of files moving around, those thousands of users, those thousands of endpoints and hundreds of vectors, and how do you use that context to better prioritize what risks matter to the business. And then the faster you can do that, the faster you can remediate. The outcome's still the same, prevent a data breach, but the methodology and the process by which we do that has to be different than the way we've always done it before as a security industry. So we start to think about what is that way? What is the better way? And it comes down to three things. How aware are you of where data is exposed? Where is the data exposure? Where is it happening? Within that exposure, what are the things that matter? Contextually, how do I prioritize what leak matters most? Because data's we're all going to admit data's leaking every day. It's just the nature of how employees work. But what are the leaks that matter, that I need to prioritize, that impact the business? And then what are the steps that I take to prevent that from becoming a data breach? How do I stop that leak from manifesting itself as a breach of information? And how do you do this contextually? And then not only prevent the breach or stop the breach, but how do you learn? How do you continually measure and optimize and improve your insider risk posture over time? Because there's one thing about insider risk in the nature of it being dynamic is it's ever changing, it's ever evolving. There's going to be new exfiltration vectors. There's going to be new ways people work. There's going to be things that happen in terms of how employees get their jobs done that are going to introduce new risks to the company. So you've got to continually measure and optimize and improve your approach to the problem. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. We're going to talk about a little bit about a contextual approach. We call it insider risk management, and it's a pragmatic view. My job in research and strategy is to take super complex issues and try to distill them down into what's the simplest way to solve this problem. Because the last thing security needs is more complex solutions to complex problems. So when we peel back the onion, we think about ultimately, what are we trying to do? And we think about this as a framework of thinking, right? So there's 5 kind of areas of thinking around this framework. Is first of all, where are we exposed? You've got to identify where you have data risk exposure across the organization. You've got to be able to determine and define what will you accept, what will you tolerate, which risk exposure is tolerable and which isn't to the business and to the different constituents within the business. And I'll talk about that in a minute. You've got to be able to have the context to prioritize, or what are the risk indicators that will be that you want to be alerted on. Because I'll tell you right now, and you probably see this in an insider risk world, there are literally thousands of alerts being fired because of the nature and the way employees work. So how do you cut through all that noise and be alerted on only the things that matter most to the business, the things that you just won't tolerate, as you've defined in the previous step? And then how do you respond? How do you remediate? Blocking is one methodology of response. That's the old way we used to do it, but there are other methodologies, what we call right-sized response, to different levels of severity of data leak or data misuse or whatever it may be. And we'll talk about right-sized response in a bit. And then why do we care? At the end of the day, following a framework like this, answering these 5 fundamental questions, you've got to be able to prove, is what we're doing, are the practices we're putting in place improving the organization's risk posture over time? And we'll talk about best practices around measuring that risk posture, defining it within your organization, but then also measuring against it and continuously measuring it and looking where you need to optimize. So fundamentally, we're going to go through these 5 things at a relatively high level, just so you have some understanding. Step 1, where are we exposed? Look across all activity. Now, it's going to sound super noisy, but you need the understanding of all of the activity happening across all the files, all the vectors, and all the signals, right? All the user signals. So file, vector, and user. And when you take this contextual approach and you're grabbing all of this activity, and that activity can surface itself in file signal as file name, file, all this metadata that you can collect, file name, file category, the file type, the volume of files moving, the sizes of files moving, the hash. Is that file new? Has it been modified? Has it been deleted? Who's the owner of that file? The creator, the originator of the file? What paths has that file taken over the course of the last 30 days, 60 days, 90 days? Are there any mismatches in that file? Does the file type not match the MIME type? So these are all signals you can derive from collecting and monitoring file activity. Same with vectors. What endpoint does this file sit on? What domain is this file moving to? Web domains, whatever it might be. Browser uploads, browser use, media, like removable media use. So there's all of this context and activity around vectors that you can pull into your contextual risk exposure. And then finally, users. Both user activity and user attributes. What's their role at the organization? Are they privileged? What department are they in? What's their employment status? Are they on a PIP? And you can pull this data in from HRC systems. You can pull some of the data in from identity access management systems. You can also do it inherent in the endpoint agent that we monitor file and vectors with as well. What hours are they working? What hours are they typically active versus inactive? Where are they in their life cycle, their history, their usage patterns, things like this. So this is all signal that we pull, and it probably sounds familiar to you because you might be pumping a lot of this data into a SIM, but you can pull this all contextually into a single platform and begin to look at where are we exposed? Where is there files of this type being uploaded via a web browser to a destination we don't trust? And who's doing that, and when are they doing that? And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we call insider risk indicators in a second. So once you've got a general understanding of where data exposure exists, you can begin to have conversations. You can begin to have conversations around what do we accept and not accept? What do we tolerate? And these will differ from one department to the next. And it will differ from one industry or company type or company size to the next. But when you start thinking about the conversations you can start having with line of business leaders, an engineering leader might say, I won't ever tolerate source code going off a trusted domain by any one of my developers. Right? You move into sales and they say, I won't tolerate, this chief revenue officer might say, I won't tolerate customer lists being downloaded from our Salesforce instance, especially if that sales rep is departing. Finance will have a different thing. Any financial data that originates in the finance department going to an untrusted domain. Marketing might have a different level of tolerance. HR might have a different level of tolerance. And once you understand the departmental level tolerance, you can begin to define what you want to be alerted on, what you prioritize. In that sea of employee activity, what are the things that you absolutely positively have to be alerted on so that you can take action on them in representation of these business leaders? And you do that largely through what we call insider risk indicators. So step 3, here's the prioritization process or approach, is you begin to take all that signal that we gathered in step 1, which is the data exposure. Where is it exposed? Files, vectors, and users. You overlay your risk tolerance conversations in step 2. Now you can begin to what we call machine your intuition. How can I chain together different activities in sequence or in bundles that will be a high level of indication that this is of a material risk to the business? And you can do any number of combinations of this. We can do it out, some of these IRIs are out of the box within our solution, but then you can also develop your own chains of you could machine your own intuition through queries and searches and alerting. So for example, an employee puts in their 2 weeks notice. That triggers HRC system to send a feed into your IRM platform. The IRM platform, in our case, Insider, our product, does an immediate 90-day look back. And 60 days ago, we saw this employee created a zip file. 59 days ago, that employee uploaded that zip file to Dropbox. That sequence of events or combination of events may trigger an insider risk indicator. This needs to be investigated. A, we don't sanction the use of Dropbox. B, zip file creation is suspicious. C, this employee is leaving. That's something to investigate. That's something that requires some sort of remediation or investigation and quite possibly remediation. You might have a large volume of file activity moving to a thumb drive on a Saturday at 3 o'clock in the morning. You might have a contract employee who is put in his Apple ID into a MacBook, and all of a sudden your corporate files are syncing to an iCloud, a personal iCloud. Maybe that contract employee downloaded a bunch of stuff from Salesforce or marketing's Google Drive with all the marketing strategy stuff in it, and now that stuff is being synced to a personal cloud. When is that contractor's term up? Again, you can begin to chain these sorts of things together in order to cut through that scribble that I showed you of all that activity to surface only the things that of a material that the line of business leaders, that the business will not tolerate. And then you get alerted on that. It's based on your intuition, and then you know when to act. So step 3, that's the prioritization model of IRM. Step 4, determine how to respond. This is where processes and policies and people come into place, right? There are occasions where an IRI might be triggered where you do nothing. You jump in, oh, this employee is departing. Actually, they zipped a bunch of photos that they had on their device. So there may be instances that you do nothing. There may be instances that, you know what, this employee has open file shares on Google Drive. I'm just going to nudge them via a Slack message. And you can automate that, right? You can assign more training, a security awareness training, or different security awareness training, or you can audit your security awareness training and say, hey, we don't have enough training on this because we see this risk perpetuating across the organization, or we see this risk perpetuating with new employees or tenured employees or employees in a certain department. You can get smarter about which security training you build and which security training you prioritize and assign. You might put that identity or that employee on some sort of watch list. Maybe it's there's pending litigation. Maybe, who knows? That's another yet form of right-sized response. You might start a case or an investigation, and you can do this inside of our product Insider, but you might need to gather more intel, do some work, and pull pieces together that you then might have to use to notify a manager, HR, legal. You might have to escalate in some way, shape, or form to an incident response team. So when you think about insider risk and managing it, you're gonna, based on the prioritization and alerts you get, there is a different way to respond based on there's another way of calling right-sized response is contextual response. Think about contextual detection, contextual investigation. Now you have contextual response, right-sized to the severity of that alert or that insider's behavior. Put it together and you begin to get to step 5. So assess it. Now we're going to go back. You're assessing your data risk exposure. You're prioritizing what data leaks matter to the organization. You're taking the right size response to prevent those data leaks from turning into breaches. And you begin to say, okay, I'm going to measure our insider risk data exposure on day 1, and then I'm going to measure it again on day 90. Has it improved? Am I going to measure it again on day 180? Has it improved? 1 year in, and you're constantly looking at, are we improving the risk posture of the organization? Not only is this valuable to the executives and the board, but it also informs you on are you doing the right things? Is the team focused on the right areas, and are they improving the risk posture and controlling the insider risk problem? You can also measure your time to detect and remediate the tried and true security metrics, but that assessing and improving your risk posture is probably the single biggest outcome of taking an insider risk management approach. Speaking of outcomes, what are the outcomes? And when we think about insider risk management, we think about the magnitude of this problem and how to manage it. You've got to be outcomes driven. And we think of outcomes in kind of three distinct pillars: productivity, security, and value. And obviously, yes, employee productivity. You're doing all of this without disrupting employee collaboration or productivity. But we also think about it in terms of the security team's productivity. How do you begin to, in the insider risk problem, how do you begin to think about, how do we improve security analysts, security team members, productivity themselves? How do you get them out of maintaining existing tech that may take weeks, months, sometimes years to deploy, constantly modifying and tuning it based on what's going on in the environment, but not really measuring its impact, not really being able to measure the outcome from an information security or data security perspective? How do you shift that formula or that focus from a security productivity perspective to more of maturity mode? We call this maintenance mode versus maturity mode. How do you shift the time and attention to not maintaining tech, but defining and prioritizing the risks that matter, machining your intuition, automating and improving how you respond and remediate to the different types of data risk that exist inside an organization? The more time spent here, the more apt and the more value you're going to deliver to the organization from a security risk posture perspective and an insider risk posture perspective specifically. So security productivity is a big focused outcome of taking an insider risk management approach. The second is a number of things. Obviously, some check the box type of stuff. Yes, here are some different use cases of truly understanding where risk presents itself in the organization. You might develop remote employee and contractor workflows for risks that surfaces there, departing employee processes. You might be looking closely at high risk employees. You might be is there compliance risk that and policy audits that you need to assess the effectiveness of. I talked about security awareness training and assessing where we need to focus more training or less training or more focused training on specific people or departments or whatever it might be. We also start to think about where risk manifests itself at an organizational level. So risk tolerance will ebb and flow. It's as dynamic as the insider risk itself. So when you're an organization that's pre-IPO, your risk tolerance is going to be extremely low. We can't have IP leaving our organization because it could impact our valuation. We cannot have this financial data leaving our organization. We cannot lose this competitive bid for this customer or lose this customer pre-IPO. Same with a merger and acquisition. In the process of companies merging or acquiring another company, you're acquiring that company for IP, for customers, for whatever. Your risk tolerance is lower in those events. And then organizational change is always a big one. Changes in policy, changes in culture, changes in restructuring, and layoffs and whatever it might be. So just having greater visibility and understanding of risk as it happens across these organizational milestones. And then finally, business outcomes. How do you check the box and ensure that your data use policies are being your employees are compliant with those? How do you do that without disrupting their productivity? How do you speed security's time to value? Again, shifting that maintenance mode to maturity mode. And overall, how do you prove that you're helping build a more risk-aware culture? by constantly measuring and improving that risk posture. How you get there is you start to think about routes to outcomes. Step one, assess that maturity, assess that risk exposure. How mature are you? This is a new world order of remote work, hybrid work, collaboration tools, productivity tools, as organizations moving extremely fast. Take a step back and assess, where are we? Where is the data exposure today? Do we need to build a program? Right? What's it going to take to build a program and processes? Do I need dedicated people? Can I leverage certain security analysts? Can I leverage the technology I have? You begin to put these pieces together. Like, what technology is it going to take? How long does it take to implement? How does it integrate with my existing stack? How do I pull in more contextual data? How do I correlate, et cetera, et cetera? How do I automate everything so that it isn't all on me to come in every day and manage, alert after alert? How does some of that remediation and response automated? And then finally, what are the metrics and how do I measure so that I can continue building and improving the risk posture of the organization? So you think about the magnitude of this problem and you think about, okay, what do I do with this information? There's fundamentally kind of three questions that we begin to ask ourselves, right? And we're doing additional research on this in terms of, people, process, and technology, right? Where do you start? We always start at people, and it's like insider risk is a different kind of problem. Do we have the right people to help manage this problem, right? Are they trained? Are we equipped? Do we have to hire people? Can we move bodies around? What's our processes look like? It's no longer block first, it's right-sized response. Do we have processes documented for the type of risk and the severity of the risk and based on the risk tolerance of our business partners? What is that incident response process when our coworkers put data at risk? And then finally, technology. Where do we need purpose-built technology? Where can we leverage existing technology to help feed and improve and streamline those people and processes, and help security be more productive and deliver real value to the organization? And again, I'm going to go back to that. I love that first quote by Dan Rather, because what we're ultimately trying to do is the same sort of thing. How do we find, in the midst of the way people work, how do we find the signals of risk amidst all this noise? Where is it surfaced contextually, across files, across vectors, across users? How do we prioritize based on those signals so that we can take swift action and continuously improve the insider risk posture of the organization? And with that, thank you. If you're at all ever interested in diving in deeper in here, please reach out to me on LinkedIn, Twitter. I think my email is in my bio as well. We have a number of resources that go in deeper into insider risk management. We actually wrote a book on this last year in 2020. So I appreciate the time. I appreciate you reaching out. And I think we'll look and chat and see if there's any questions. Thank you.